Sean todas y todos bienvenidos a la continuación de este seminario, en el cual en estos momentos vamos a tener la participación del señor Manas Roshan. Él es oficial de programas del Colectivo Internacional de Apoyo a los Trabajadores de la Pesca, ICSF, con sede en Chennai, India. Esta es una organización no gubernamental internacional que trabaja para el establecimiento de pesquerías equitativas, con igualdad de género, autosuficiencia y sostenibles, particularmente en el sector artesanal y la pesca de pequeña escala. El señor Manas nos hablará sobre los principales retos relacionados con el trabajo digno y el impacto de la COVID-19 en las condiciones laborales de los trabajadores. Sin más, con ustedes, el señor Manas. Adelante.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just share my screen. I hope you all can see it. I'm sorry that I'm going to be speaking in English. I don't speak Spanish, but I have very well understood, thanks to our very able translators, what you've all been saying. And I've also tried to capture most of the material on the slide so that you can all follow, and I'd be happy to share this with all of you later. To begin with, I just want to thank the organizers, including Salamaris, OSPESCA, FAO, and the other participating organizations for such an interesting session. And it's particularly useful that ICSF's presentation comes after my colleagues in ITF and IUF have spoken from a worker's perspective. I'll be speaking to you today more from a small-scale fisheries perspective, not just on the challenges and the opportunities for delivery of decent work and social development for fishing communities in Central America and other parts of the world, but also how the impacts of COVID-19 may have affected the world of work, particularly in the small-scale fisheries perspective. I think some of this material, of course, will overlap with what others have spoken over the last few days, and I will go over that quite quickly. But to begin with, since we've spoken so much about large-scale fisheries, distant water vessels, but also larger vessels. My apologies. About large-scale fishing, particularly for vessels larger than 20 to 24 meters, I think it's important to point out, as in other parts of the world, in this region, Rica region as well, the majority of captured fish production happens from, is contributed from the small-scale fishing sector of vessels below 12 meters, 80 to 90%. In fact, if the production comes from there, the fleet, the fleet and the workers are in these, and about 50% of the catch comes from small-scale fisheries production. A majority of this fish that is caught is in fact consumed locally, and in the larger Latin American and Caribbean region, the intra-regional fish trade is second only to Asia. In Asia, it's about 60%. In the Latin American and Caribbean region, it's 51% of the fish is moving internally. So we're not just talking about international markets, large and long value chains. We're also talking about very short value chains, very local fisheries as well, and the challenges that they present. According to the data from FAO, the employment in this sector is about 150,000, and we can of course multiply that by about 3 to look at the value chain, but we know that with all of the other activities and the dependence in the sector, it's about 1.8 million people that depend on the sector. So that's a significant population that we're talking about the welfare and social development of. Just to widen the scope, when we mention decent work and labor and working and living conditions of workers in the sector, we need to consider the entire value chain, which includes not just the harvest or the capture of fish, but also the pre and the post-harvest activities. And within fishing, when we only talk about fishing or capture using craft and gear, we also leave out a whole section of workers, including women, who are in the majority of show-based activities, gleaners, shell fish and mollusk gatherers, and others who also have a large stake in the sector and who contribute to the food security and livelihoods that this sector contributes to. So in Central America, these, when we talk about capture fishing itself, this includes diverse practices, as we've heard from many presenters, which includes diving, show-based activities, and small-scale fishing for subsistence, using both motorized and unmotorized craft, to small-scale commercial operations that have various kinds of craft and gear combinations for domestic consumption, to artisanal trawling, purse seining, and other long lining for tuna and other species for export markets. Then we, in this region particularly, unlike, let's say, some parts of Asia that I inhabit, recreational fishing for tourism is also a major part, and we have increasingly a share of this contributing to the livelihoods in fisheries. As we already said, of course, most of this small-scale fisheries is under 12 meters. So what often happens, as we'll see later, is that they do not fit into the purview of the conventions that we're talking about, either of the ILO nor of the safety guidelines and documents of the IMO. Though, of course, there is also guidelines and codes for vessels under 12 meters on safety. Small-scale fish workers, as we will also see with the legislation in these countries, currently have quite limited access to formal mechanisms to ensure decent work and social development of workers in the sector. Often they're limited by conditions that stipulate that there needs to be a minimum number of workers in an establishment, such as a fishing boat, or even show-based industries that sometimes exclude small-scale fisheries, or they're too informal in their arrangements, lacking in workers' agreements and salaried work to be counted in the legislations and policy of the country. And since we're talking about, I think our FAO colleagues have stressed social protection, and we'll come to that later. In many parts of the world, especially in the most vulnerable communities, the access to the fishing ground and secure tenure rights over fishery resources itself is a social protection that provides for the basic needs of the fishing communities and their families. So from food to health to educational needs. So when we talk about decent work, we also need to look at it as a much more connected concept to access to resources, access to other forms of social protection as well. This is a photo that kind of illustrates just one of many types of fishing craft and gear that exist in the sector. We talked about how women are a major part of the fisheries value chain, usually counted as 50% of the workforce. But when we look at the post and pre-harvest activities, these can be sometimes as high as 70 to 80% of the workforce is from women. In the primary sector, that is the harvest of fish in the region, especially in Central America, women are engaged in harvesting bivalves, shellfish, mollusks, other species. Women also prepare nets and also bait fish and fishing lines. And often these roles that they play in the sector are not adequately recognized in policy because they're limited to the domestic sphere, and their contributions are often just counted as voluntary work, which often excludes them from a lot of social protection and other labor regulations and other entitlements. Some of the other concerns that need to be taken on board when we talk about women's work in fisheries is their occupational health and safety. So Kirill talked about how women are particularly vulnerable in processing plants, fish processing plants, but we also need to look at informal processing, vending workers who spend long hours without proper safety equipment in cold water and damp conditions, which leads to a lot of arthritic problems, joint pains, other issues, and they very rarely get recognized in the health studies of the sector. But they also lack sanitation facilities, social protection, and most of all, participation in decision making, especially with the access to resources or in the management of the fisheries. They very rarely play a role. Just to illustrate some of the diverse kind of practices that we have even in the region, this is a photo from Costa Rica, provided by our member, Vivian, who is also present here, and I hope she'll be able to participate in the discussion. Now, some of the challenges when it comes to the fishing activities in small-scale fisheries, including in the Central American region, are, of course, as many have pointed out, a majority of the sector, subsectors, workers are engaged in small-scale artisanal fishing. So there's no formal work agreements. There's very little unionization or cooperative networks that might have existed because of a history of cooperative movements in many countries have also eroded because of various political and social dimensions. Most of all, as happens not just in small scale, but also large scale fisheries, one of the main issues that comes up in ensuring formalization in the sector is the share system of wages. So as you all very well know, it's either a share of the catch or a combination of a wage system and a share system that we see most often in fisheries, especially small-scale fisheries of owner-operator type of vessels. It's a share system of remuneration. Then what is often goes neglected in small-scale fishing, which there's also a culture of risk-taking in, is the occupational safety and health issues, including the risk of accidents and other health hazards that come as a result of very precarious and sometimes badly built craft, other kinds of hazardous work in the sector, the predominant use of child labor in sometimes in benign settings, but also in hazardous work in small-scale fisheries, but also the overwhelming presence of migrant workers in the sector, especially in long-haul fishing operations, especially going on for several days. And in this part of the world as well, migrant workers' conditions tend to be much poorer. There are much fewer opportunities for engagement with unions. They're not part of many unions. And also they're not recognized in national legislation. Sometimes that might ensure them entitlements in terms of social protection. I won't go into too much detail on the international legal framework because many of our colleagues here have already talked about the ILO C-188, the Work in Fishing Convention, the various IMO, FAO, ILO safety recommendations and guidelines. But it's also important because we're talking about children, women, and others to stress the other conventions of the ILO, including the latest one on the Convention on Violence and Harassment in the World of Work, and also their conventions on forced labor, child labor, minimum wage, which see a much higher rate of ratification and enforcement in the countries that we represent here, rather than C-188. The instrument that we work with most closely now in the small-scale fisheries world is the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries. This was endorsed by the FAO Committee on Fisheries in 2014 and was developed through a participatory ground-up process which involved over 4,000 stakeholders, mainly from civil society and fish worker organizations around the world, and multiple consultations were held in Central America, as well in Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and others, both before the development of the guidelines and during the development of the guidelines and after it, to talk about the implementation. And our colleagues from OSPESCA have already touched upon this. It's important to stress that in the small-scale fisheries guidelines, which are informed by human rights, which underpin every principle in the guidelines, social development of fishing communities is deemed a prerequisite to realize these rights and to also empower the small-scale fishing communities. So what does that mean? As we go into especially the chapter 6 of the guidelines, we look at how diverse the sector, of course, is and its workers, and the various kinds of needs and the differential kind of vulnerabilities that the sector has within it. So the guidelines have recommendations on social security protection for workers in the sector, on ensuring decent work, the eradication of forced labor, prevention of debt bondage of women, men, and children, the educational and livelihood rights of children, that they should have a free choice to choose the vocation that they would like, which is often, we know that it's a fallback option in the sector to fish when the conditions are very poor, but the efforts of many of our stakeholders in the sector is to not have this kind of a negative connotation attached to the livelihoods in fishing, and to make it a desirable job opportunity for the communities that have historically been fishing. So it also talks about the need to harmonize the national laws and regulations to be consistent with ILO, IMO conventions. And this is something that requires regional coordination, as many of our colleagues, both yesterday and today, have stressed on, and the guidelines also goes into this aspect. So where do we stand with regards to the implementation or the ratification of many of these both soft and hard legal instruments? As has been already mentioned, some countries have ratified both the UNCLOS and the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, as well as the Port State Measures Agreement, the latter having the least kind of ratification in the region so far. But it's really a heartening news from our colleagues here that we're moving towards more, a greater number of countries ratifying these instruments. As has already been said, none in this Central American region have ratified ILOC 188, but in the region, Argentina and Antigua and Barbuda in the Caribbean have presented really positive examples and good practices for how this can be achieved. Antigua, Barbuda, the latest, in fact, it's not in force yet. And they, you can really maybe get some lessons on how the progressive implementation of the Work and Fishing Convention can be seen through the experience of these countries as we go forward. An often neglected convention is the American Convention on Human Rights 1969, which stresses on the rights of children, freedom from forced labor, freedom of association, and other economic, social, and cultural rights that are part of the international legal framework. So this is also something that we need to always highlight in the context of fisheries as well. It's important to not reinvent the wheel and to not repeat a lot of actions that are already ongoing and to learn from them in the region. So as has already been said, the OSPESCA has already activated the implementation of the SSF guidelines through a resolution. And in its new integration policy on fisheries and aquaculture, we also see that the SSF guidelines will be taken into account in any plans for the sector in these 8 countries. Costa Rica, of course, has made great progress, especially between 2015 and 17 in the implementation of the guidelines, where they developed a roadmap through the project of law 20750, which was an action plan and a bill to implement the SSF guidelines. But this is pending approval. in the country and requires follow-up and as well as exchange, as had been happening earlier, where Costa Rican fishing communities had been sharing knowledge with their colleagues in Belize, in Nicaragua, and other parts of the region. There needs to be greater exchange on what are the commonalities in terms of social development, resource access, and other issues in small-scale fisheries, so that the implementation of the guidelines can be a much more cooperative, collaborative process. And the International Year of Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture 2022, which is coming up, is a great opportunity to progress on some of these plans that had been made over the years, and now COVID has temporarily put a pause to. Daniela, our colleague from FAO, has repeatedly talked about the need for social protection in the sector. As we know from many studies in different parts of the world, small-scale fishing communities are often poor and marginalized and represent some of the most vulnerable communities in their countries' national populations. In Central America, it's particularly important to stress the rights of indigenous people, who, as this recent report on the state of indigenous people from the UN showed, for example, in Panama and Guatemala, their poverty rates are sometimes to the factor of 5 and 2 and 3 times higher than the rest of the population. So why do we talk about social protection? This supports against uncertainties, vulnerabilities, and risks in the sector, and particularly in Latin America, which is both vulnerable currently to disasters and climate change, and as we see from the recent reports of the IPCC, is going to see a higher frequency or intensity of disasters in the years to come. Such social protection measures will help to guard the workers in this sector. The ILO recommends that national social protection flows should comprise at least 4 basic elements, and that is healthcare, basic income security, so that children's needs, especially to nutrition, education, and healthcare, are taken care of. Basic income security for persons that are sick, disabled, unemployed, and finally, old age pensions and other security for the elderly. And as we've seen with the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic, the social protection flows, as well as the eligibility of various kinds of workers, has been severely lacking in many developing countries as well as developed countries. So what we're seeing is that the social protection that is offered is very, very small and unable to meet even the most basic needs of the fishing communities, or sometimes they're entirely left out of the social protection nets that exist. We spoke about indigenous people, very, very important part of the fisheries sector in the region. So ICSF was also invited in the brief time that we have to speak about the impacts of COVID-19 on decent work in the fisheries sector, particularly in small-scale fisheries. And I think our colleagues from ITF have already touched upon the sequence of events, but we need to also talk about IUU fishing or decent work from the perspective of some of the vulnerabilities in the sector. So what the pandemic did, despite the announcement that fish would be declared an essential food and the workers in the sector essential workers or essential service providers in the sector, was that the pandemic prevention and control measures such as localized lockdowns or nationwide lockdowns or other movement restrictions, they created both supply side and demand side disruptions and bottlenecks, such as in the movement of workers and inputs, whether that is fuel or ice or food and rations, but also in the aquaculture sector, for example, the access to fry and hatcheries that could provide inputs for the aquaculture sector. So there were widespread disruptions in supply, there were cancellation of orders, there were closure of fishing operations because workers were no longer available. And on the demand side, of course, as has already been stressed with the closure of restaurants, the tourism sector, local markets, and the slump in the economy, which caused a decline in the incomes and purchasing power of citizens, there was also a decline in the demand for fish, which is often a luxury for many communities, or even when an important source of protein. So specifically in the region, I was just looking at the latest data reported by the WHO and Johns Hopkins University, and we see that while the number of deaths, the aggregate number is quite low, in specific countries such as Panama and Costa Rica, the number of cases and deaths as a proportion of the population is quite alarmingly high. But we're not only looking at the impacts of COVID on the health of its citizens, but the much wider ramifications on economic and livelihood impacts. So the combined impact of COVID-19 and the recent hurricanes in the region in 2020 are estimated to have pushed 8 million people are expected to face acute food insecurity, and about nearly 1 million people in the region were pushed into such food insecurity as a direct result of COVID and the hurricanes. And that's a very, very difficult number for all of us to stomach. In the wider Latin American and Caribbean region, the labor force contracted by more than 20 million people, which witnessed the sharpest decline in working hours, both formal and informal, in the world, according to the ILO's latest reports. And it's often thought that only the formal sector is captured in this data, but what we often miss is that these have spillover effects, and the informal sector often absorbs a lot of the attrition in the formal sector. And so we see that, for example, in the Caribbean region, as well as in the Latin American region, the fisheries has played a major role, as it has in Asia, in absorbing a lot of workers that would otherwise have left their hometowns or even their countries to go and work in other parts of the world, in other industries, whether that's manufacturing or service industries, have now come back and fallen back on fisheries. And this, of course, has an impact on the sustainability of the resources, the fishery resources, but also social impacts such as equity, conflicts, and others. This is a terrifying image, as reported in Reuters, the news service from Nicaragua, as a result of the recent hurricane, which has reportedly destroyed about $78 million worth of infrastructure, including boats, fishing implements, houses, and other infrastructure of coastal fishing communities. Some of the specific impacts when we talk about work in fishing and in fish processing that we were able to gather through our networks, ICSF's networks of members, including in the region and in other parts of the world, were a decline in the number of vessels and crew in small-scale artisanal fishing, which of course had wide impacts on the livelihoods and foods security of families on the coast, and as well as in inland areas, an increased burden of household duties on women.
Disculpe, estamos escuchando a las dos intérpretes.
Sorry, am I short on time? Or is interpretation working? Okay, I'll continue. So what this has really led to, and I would really invite all of our participants here to report on what's happening in the region, but we see this in Asia and Africa, where you see a reduced labor force participation, not just of men, but mainly of women. So women have faced a much larger share of these impacts in terms of job losses, both in fisheries as well as in other sectors. And because of the poor access, as we've already stressed, of the vulnerable coastal communities to healthcare and diagnostics, such as testing facilities, we see the impacts such as what Kirill talked about on fishing boats. So infected fish workers on board distant water fishing vessels, unable to access healthcare. Many countries that had imposed travel restrictions and did not allow workers to disembark on their ports prevented many workers on board both merchant ships as well as fishing vessels from coming back to shore. This we saw in Argentina, in Alaska, in the Americas, but also in many Asian, Southeast Asian countries as well. And one of the main concerns has been talked about by workers' representatives here is the repatriation of stranded migrant workers. And we often only talk about migrant workers that are interstate or international migrant workers. But in countries like India, for example, as we may have also seen in your region, internal migrants were unable to move when the lockdown is nationwide. And this led to severe hardships because most of them live on board fishing vessels when they're docked on the shore or at ports, or are sleeping in the rough without any shelter. So their needs for shelter, food, healthcare, and other needs were severely neglected. But there was also the increased risk of forced labor, as we saw from ITF and IUF's presentations, not just on fishing vessels, but as has been reported in many parts of the world, in the processing sector as well, in many factories where men and women were asked to work overtime or were prevented from leaving or had to work under inhuman conditions. These are some of the major concerns in the time of COVID. So it's not just gloom and doom that we want to talk about, because we are 2 years in and we need to highlight the good practices that have been adopted by many, not just states and governments, but also civil society actors, international organizations of the UN and others. So in terms of ensuring that COVID-19 doesn't spread to workers in the sector, we see several good initiatives in the region, such as from Costa Rica, from Peru, with operational guidelines on how to prevent the spread of the virus and the disease, both in the fishing boats as well as in processing and other workers as well. We see very good guidance from the NFFO, the National Fish Workers Organization of the UK Fisheries Industry, on guidance for COVID prevention and risk assessment on board fishing vessels. And we also see a great, this link is provided in the presentation if you go to the UK NFFO website, on all the various entitlements and social protection measures that were announced by the UK government and were demanded for by the fisheries sector. This has been very well listed. So I think we need more of these efforts being done by organizations like OSPESCA and other regional organizations and national organizations to highlight some of these measures that are available in the sector as a reaction or a response to COVID-19. The FAO has also done a great job in collecting and disseminating information on impacts of COVID-19, not just on small-scale fisheries, as I say in the presentation, but wider impacts on agriculture sector workers, fisheries sector workers. But what has been lacking, I think, is that we saw a kind of fever of activities in the first half of this pandemic in 2020. But as we reach the end of the year, November and December, we've seen much less of a follow-up. So we don't really completely know what is going on now with the second and third waves. What are those impacts? You know, have people gone further into debt and poverty? Is there a continuing issue of forced labor and labor violations in the sector? This is something that we need more work on. Civil society has played a very big role in disseminating both information, but also providing support to fishing communities through direct marketing initiatives. As my colleague Vivian has pointed out in the chat, but this was also being done in Brazil, in Mexico, in other parts of the Latin American region, but also in many parts of Europe and the US and Canada as well. We haven't seen much of this in Asia because of the sheer scale of the sector. In many countries, we see social protection being expanded to include more workers and vulnerable populations. So for example, Brazil, as a result of the demands of the fish worker organizations in Brazil, they have been included in the monthly payments of about, it comes to about, I think, 60 euros a month, the payment going. And this was initially for a period of 3 months, which was extended for 6 months, and now it's extended by 8 months. And we also see this in many countries in the region, in the SICA region. So if I'm not mistaken, Nicaragua, Honduras and others also have such payments, but it would remain to be seen if fishing community, especially fish workers, both men and women, have access to some of these entitlements for the most vulnerable. This is a photo of the direct marketing initiative in Costa Rica, which was initiated by the Marine Responsible Fishing Area Network with the support of Cope Solidar and the Territories of Life, Marine Territories of Life Network in Costa Rica. And it'll be, if any of you have more questions on this, I think Vivian is still here. And I'd like to acknowledge ICSF's members in the region and our network of fishery stakeholders who give us precious inputs on for this presentation, but also to thank many of you. Your presentations have really enriched mine. So I'd love to invite questions at the end of this. Sorry if I went over time.
No, muchas gracias, Maná. Estaba en el tiempo. Si tenemos alguna pregunta, con mucho gusto, por favor, escribirla en el chat para poder transmitirla y que quede el registro de su participación. Nos han dado una visión sobre las diferentes áreas en la región y Latinoamérica y el Caribe, combinándola un poco con los factores asiáticos y mundiales, lo que da una visión bastante real de lo que es la situación en el sector de la pesca y la agricultura, en este caso de la pequeña escala y artesanal, y sobre también las medidas sobre la COVID. Indiscutiblemente que la COVID afectó todo el mundo y no, la región no escapa de ello. Nuestra región por la COVID fue afectada un 80-90% inicialmente a las actividades de la cadena de valor de la pesca y la agricultura, dado a las problemáticas de lo que fue el traslado de la persona, lo que fueron las cuarentenas, ¿verdad? Y el sector se ha venido recuperando. Sin embargo, hay que seguir trabajando en ello. Para ello, entonces, aquí en la región, a través de OSPESCA y COCATRAM y lo que es el COMISCA, que es la Comisión de Ministros de la Salud, trabajando de manera intersectorial, se sacaron lineamientos para lo que eran las embarcaciones. Eso es importante, como lo mencionaste, para lo que es la seguridad y protección de los pescadores y las pescadoras ante esta enfermedad, ante este flagelo, por el cual estamos todavía pasando, ¿verdad? No se ha terminado. Ha mencionado que una segunda, una tercera ola que ha tenido ese sentido.